Greetings ladies and middlegents, and welcome to this latest edition of RE351, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Species 57, written by crumjd. We were fairly sure that we had a note about humanity before we were even able to read it. Wait, that's not starting in the right place. Mankind grew and expanded on Earth for countless eons, thinking that we were alone in the universe. We kept faith that benign gods might watch over us, and we hoped that someday we might meet friendly beings from amongst the stars. However, all we ever had was faith and hope, never any proof. We invented fire, and then the wheel, and then the warp drive. For 250 years we spread out into the cosmos and away from our little blue and green orb, and although the wider galaxy brought us incredible riches, it also seemed to confirm our fear. We were alone. Then we found something built by a thinking mind, but not by human hands. It was a space station, located about 2,000 light years from Earth. It seemed to be an astronomical research facility, or at least it was in tight orbit around a rather interesting binary system composed of a smallish black hole and a largish companion star. The gravitational effects as the singularity devoured the star were certainly worth a second look. However, we were obviously more interested in the station. It had been nearly destroyed by a solar flare of some sort, but we were still able to learn a fair amount. It had a crew. They were tripedal and apparently vulnerable to radiation because they all seemed to have died in the same instant. They were mummified by the lack of breathable atmosphere. The station was rather low-tech. It had, of all the perverse things, direct orbital telescopes. Mankind had learned to build digital sensors with a pixel density that dwarfed the human eye long before we'd learned to build warp drives, so everyone was mystified as to why the aliens would want to look at things through the lens. We speculated that it was something cultural, or perhaps that their eyes were really, really good. But speculation was all it was. We couldn't ask the dead. However, most of all, the station had records. The first thing we managed to puzzle out was their calendar system. They had recorded novas, meteors, and asteroid orbits, and a great many of other ticks and tocks of the great celestial clock that mankind had also observed, so it was pretty trivial for us to convert their timestamps to our units. The date system put us onto something very interesting. There was a record dated the same day humanity had finally achieved warp. At that point, it became imperative that we translate the entry. The flare had killed them, almost destroyed their records, but if you took a scanning electron microscope to the storage media and inspected it at the atomic level, patterns could still be retrieved. We rebuilt databases and fed them into our computers. We eventually deciphered their language and video storage formats. From them, we were able to find video with captions and correlate words to images. We broke their language and read, "Species 57 has escaped from prison planet 501I-3. Evacuation has begun." For many people, this just confirmed that they were talking about humanity. Clearly, we were too violent, or careless with our environment, or unenlightened, or religious and illogical, or something, and we got locked up for it. A small percentage of people held out hope for a little while. We had evolved on Earth. How could we be Species 57? What had Australopithecus done something naughty? Anyways, how was Earth a prison exactly? It wasn't like it had bars. Still, we had an astronomical research station. It wasn't exactly hard to find a star chart. 50I-3 was Earth. We were the dreaded Species 57, and apparently the reason that we were alone was that everyone else was fleeing in terror. Reactions were varied. On one end of the spectrum, you had people who basically wanted to prove that we could be good prisoners. The most extreme version of this said that we should give up technology, hole up in the Sol system, and wait for a parole board hearing. Their opponents wanted to build a giant war fleet, go find whoever had locked us up in the first place, beat them up, and take their stuff. The two factions went back and forth on that. They put forward a great many arguments, both good and utterly mind-numbingly bad. They really didn't win each other over at all, and that didn't matter. Politics is downstream from culture, and that is mostly downstream from history. By that point, more people lived or worked or traveled out of the Sol system than always stayed inside of it. None of them intended to move back to Earth just because some old alien record said that we were supposed to be imprisoned there. In the end, 3 things happened. We built up our militaries a bit, even though we'd mostly gotten over fighting with each other. A few Neo-Luddites settled on Earth and gave the Mennonites competition at the churning butter and trying to be a holy game. And we put a fair amount of effort into answering the great question. Seriously, WTF? For 100 years, that proved to be an elusive answer. We found other ruins and even other records, though the other species had made a point to destroy anything they couldn't take with them. None of them told us what made humanity a puppy-assaulting freak show, that they were willing to abandon the galaxy just because they suspected that we were going to be puttering around it. But we got some hints. We were, apparently, thought to be violent. Sort of, anyway. The records we found for non-humans suggested that they were capable of murder and war. We just did those things differently. Aliens are also deeply disturbed by our sense of humor, or perhaps just humor in general. How we viewed adversity and death seemed to bother them. In fact, overall, we seemed to be a starfish alien to most of the galaxy, a race too bizarre to properly share space with. Seemed is the operative word. The alien records were weird. It was like none of them were very interested in writing down their history. Even where we found a truly solid record dealing with historical events, they seemed to be structured as entertainment. Moreover, their tech was strange. Some of it was amazingly primitive, like the telescopes at the observatory. Other artifacts did inexplicable things our sciences couldn't duplicate. When our next clue came, mankind had made it to the center of the Milky Way. We only went there in the form of far-ranging research ships and colonies founded by people who really didn't want any neighbors. But we were capable of traveling the 25,000 light years in a relatively reasonable amount of time. As such, there were human sensors around to capture what seemed like a very strange warp wake, and there were human research vessels there to race to what became known as the Shattered Ship. This Shattered Ship was, well, a ship. However, it wasn't like any human ship. By that time, our vessels were shaped by robust gravity manipulation technology. We didn't need hulls to keep air in or subatomic particles out. Most people flew around in fanciful habitats that looked like trees, or suburban houses complete with lawns, or magic carpets. The ship we found looked like a vessel from the very dawn of space exploration. A series of pressurized tubes and bubbles hooked together in flimsy little gantries. It made absolutely no sense. If whoever made that ship had come from another galaxy, then they had to have gravitic control that made ours look like stone tools. The ship's pressure hull couldn't just be cheapness, because the cheapest way to keep air in a ship is a few lines of computer code to shape the gravitic envelope correctly. It wasn't a safety feature, because if a gravity drive fails, the steel of the hull we found wasn't going to stand up to it. A proton can't stand up to the force gradient of a failing gravity drive. A safety feature on a warp ship is a second gravitic emitter. There was a real rub. We didn't find a gravitic emitter of any sort. That, and it had been ripped to shreds. The hab modules were all open to raw space, frozen and unlivable. The metal gantries that had connected them floated twisted in the void. The race that had once crewed the vessel was all dead. Most of their records were gone as well. That wasn't due to the damage of the remainder of the ship. It seemed to be a failsafe of some sort triggered when the ship became unlivable. We were only able to pull a single line out of the buffer of what seemed to be a communications device. It said, "Survey of A1 complete. Being 57 apparently remains trapped within despite the unprecedented spread of species 57. By this time, we didn't need to work to translate the message or the coordinates. A1 was Sagittarius A. Something in there was apparently related to mankind, and it was alive. If mankind is somewhat violent, then we are very curious. If you give us a big red button, we will poke it with a stick sooner or later. As such, there really wasn't much question. We needed to bust our partner in crime out of its prison, figure out what it was, and then ask it what was going on, and maybe where the loot was stashed. That was easier said than done. The event horizon of a black hole is where gravitational acceleration is higher than the speed of light, so any warp drive is sufficient to get you inside a black hole, and then out again safely. Then again, there are black holes, and then there's the all-devouring maw of Sagittarius A, the supermassive beast around which 400 billion stars of the Milky Way dance. We worked for another 75 years on that problem. Gravitics could be built that were large enough to unfold the beast, or at least part of it. But they weren't going to be the sort of thing that could be moved. We would have to assemble infrastructure outside of Sagittarius A, and then essentially poke a corridor of habitable space-time down into it like a giant straw. It ended up taking 5 massive space stations, each the size of a moon. They were impressive, humbling and uplifting at all at once. They were worlds with mountain ranges made of capacitor banks, great canyons of electrical cabling, and continental plates of gravity-emitting diodes. We never would have powered it all, except we were in the most energetic neighborhood in the entire galaxy. So yet more world-sized machines were built to harvest energy from the inconceivably potent electromagnetic fields of its accretion disk. In the end, it was the greatest work of our species. When we turned it on, the disk around Sagittarius A rolled like a living thing. That look was accentuated by tendrils of plasma that rose off the disk as gravity in those areas decreased. It could have been a jellyfish. Well, if a jellyfish were the size of a solar system and were composed of the hottest plasma in the universe, moving at nearly the speed of light, such a creature would have a hell of a sting. But that was just a special effect. The real action was the column of livable space descending through the event horizon towards the center of the hole. At first, that didn't look like much. At first. Then it found whatever matter and energy, whatever state of being was there in the center. For an instant, the singularity was naked. A column of energy, of raw reality set aflame erupted from it. The force was beyond description. Even scientific estimates failed. No one knew how many zeros to put after the number that would describe the event. This jet of matter would move Sagittarius A, and with it, the entire Milky Way. Here was our creature's sting. And in that column of fire a being was reborn. It had the form of a man. No, of a god. We knew that instantly, because every human mind within 100 light years was immediately read front to back, judged, called to account, forgiven, loved. It communicated with us and explained what had happened. To the other beings in the universe, we were things of contradiction and darkness. It wasn't that we were bad exactly. They did have murder and war, but they didn't have madness. They didn't kill for no reason or fight past the reasonable hope of victory. They feared death, but they didn't obsess about it and try to build great things to defeat it. They didn't understand humor, which always comes from pain. They couldn't see the hope in a flower growing up through a pile of rubble. They couldn't say c'est la vie, or the Lord gives one the Lord takes away, or 1,000 other things in 1,000 other languages, and accept and carry on. In short, we were a race that had somehow taken darkness into our souls and found strength. They didn't understand it, and they feared us. They had tossed our God into a well and left us to die on our home world. Any of them would have done exactly that without divinity to patch the holes in their technology and provide otherwise impossible toys. However, we had lived, and God had eventually been able to rip apart one of the ships to send us a message. We asked God what we would do, and he proved that he was our God. We needed to punch our enemies right in the eye, but first we needed to save the lost souls. We were confused. No one would doubt after they actually met God, and much of what we already believed was true. Which made God chuckle, because he does have a sense of humor. No, he was being literal. He hadn't been able to attend to our dead while he was trapped, and so they were wandered lost. In some cases, becoming very twisted and dangerous. They needed to be saved. After the comeuppance was going to be delivered to certain other races and their gods. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.